Hey, have you ever wanted to be the star of the show? Have you wanted to be the one who gets recognized for great achievements, even if it comes at the expense of somebody else? Well, today we're going to look at what happens when the sidekick wants to be the star on this week's lesson. Hello, welcome to this week's lesson. I'm Brian Vermeer, and we're continuing our series on sidekicks today. And today we're going to look at what happens when the sidekick wants to be the star. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind you to be sure and hit the like button on the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow the Facebook page, and if at all possible, if you can help, please consider giving to the Patreon page. For only $5 a month, you can see exclusive videos that you'll only get there, and along with some other things as well. So today we're going to be looking at Haman from the book of Esther. Now I'm sure you've heard the tale of Esther quite a bit, but we're going to be looking at this from Haman's viewpoint this time, from the viewpoint of the bad guy. Now, a little bit of history. Let's catch up to where we are. Israel has been conquered by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. Many of the Israelites were taken away to live in Babylon. And while they were there, they kept their own identity. That is, they did not intermarry with the Babylonians. They did not assimilate into the Babylonian culture. They remained Jewish people. And in fact, this is where they began to be called Jews, because they were mostly from the tribe of Judah. And they kept their own identity. They wouldn't assimilate. They would not follow the customs of the Babylonians. Well, 70 years later, the Babylonians are conquered by Cyrus the Great and the Medo-Persian Empire, and many of the Jews are allowed to go back to Israel. Zerubbabel leads a group. Ezra leads a group. They rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Nehemiah leads a group back, and they rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. But many Jews also decided just to stay in the Persian Empire because either they were too old to travel, or maybe they had set up a business there and they were, doing well. So, why would I want to pack up and leave and go back? This is the life. If they were born there, maybe, this is the life I've always known. So Mordecai, who we're going to be talking about in this story, is a Jewish man who has decided to stay in Persia. And in fact, he is living in Shushan, or Susa, the capital of Persia. It's a city close to the Tigris River in the western part of what is today known as Iran. Very close to the border with Iraq. And he's living there, and he's living close to the palace. His cousin Esther, or Hadassah, actually her Hebrew name, wins a contest to become the new queen, or at least to become one of the new wives of King Ahasuerus. And so Mordecai is going to the palace gate every day, mainly just to find out what's going on, to make sure that Esther is being treated okay. Well, let's take a look now at what's going to bring on the conflict in this story. So we're in Esther. Let's look at chapter 3, verses 1 to 5 of the book of Esther. It says, "After all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. The entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, because the king had commanded this to be done for him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. The members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, 'Why are you disobeying the king's command?' When they warned him day after day and he still would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see if Mordecai's action would be tolerated, since he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him homage, he was filled with rage. So King Ahasuerus has promoted this man named Haman to the position of his royal vizier, you might say. He is the guy who is in charge of the palace. He is the second in command to the king. He is very high up there. He is the king's sidekick. But I think Haman probably has, some higher ambitions. We're going to see Haman has a lot of ambition for himself, at least. And I do want to start off and say that there's nothing wrong with ambition in and of itself. There's nothing wrong with ambition, because without ambition, nothing would get done. But when ambition turns to selfishness, and when in order to achieve your ambitions, you have to step on the others, then it can become sinful. And I think that's what God warns us against, that kind of selfish ambition. Jesus says we are to be servants to others. We should not lord it over others. But Haman gets promoted, and it says everyone at the king's gate, all of the king's staff, all the palace guard, would bow down and pay homage to Haman when he apparently came in and out of the castle. Except Mordecai. Now Mordecai, again, he's just hanging around there. He doesn't live there. He doesn't have a job there or anything. He's just hanging around because he wants to hear news about his cousin Esther. But as Haman goes in and out, everyone bows down to Haman except Mordecai. And it says the people who notice this, it's not Haman who notices this. It's a couple of the palace guards who notice this. And it says they ask Mordecai, why are you not doing this? Why are you not bowing down and paying homage to Haman? And something interesting you might notice about the book of Esther, or you may not have noticed in the book of Esther, apparently Mordecai tells them it's because he's Jewish. But something interesting here, we know that the Jews would not bow down to anyone other than God. But something interesting about the book of Esther is if you read the entire book of Esther, you will not see the word God anywhere in there. Esther is the only book of the Bible that does not specifically mention God. It does talk about Mordecai being Jewish, but it does not specifically say that he wouldn't bow down because he only bows down to God. This is why the Roman Catholic Church and a few other groups have added some chapters to the book of Esther. They've added some apocryphal chapters to the book of Esther in order to have God actually be mentioned in there. That's one of the reasons those are added. That's why they're not found in Protestant Bibles. They're not found in the Jewish Tanakh, these extra chapters that have been added by the Catholics and some others. They're not part of the original Jewish scriptures. They were put in order to bring God into the book. And that's why most churches today still don't include them. So the book of Esther does not mention God. That's just an interesting point there. But it says he wouldn't listen to them. He wouldn't listen to the guards. So they told Haman. And what I think is interesting here is that apparently Haman never noticed. Haman did not notice that Mordecai was not bowing down to him until it was brought to his attention. And then I'm sure after that, every time he went in and out, then he would look over and notice Mordecai not doing it. And only then does it say, was Haman filled with rage. We don't often get offended at something until somebody tells us we ought to be. Today, we hear the word offended a whole lot. We have people who are afraid to do things because they might offend others. And it is interesting today, it's almost become a joke. If you are not offended by something today, don't worry, somebody else will be offended for you, and somebody else will tell you that you should be offended. There may be things going on that you don't notice at all. But then somebody points it out to you and says, notice this is, bad, this is wrong. And then you notice it, and then you get mad about it. And there are many examples today where people are going around, protesting things that they think are wrong. But the people who honestly should be offended by it aren't. They don't care about it. But the politically correct, if you want to call it the woke generation today, they're just going around looking for things to be offended by. Haman probably would never have noticed if the guards hadn't brought it to his attention. But as soon as they did, then he became offended by it. And he finds out then that Mordecai is Jewish, and that's why he won't do it. This kind of reminds me of an interesting historical event. We've just had the Olympic Games. My wife and I, my family, we've been watching the Olympic Games in the past couple of weeks. And during the opening ceremonies, I commented to my daughter and told her about the 1936 games that were held in Berlin, Germany. And this is during the time that Adolf Hitler was the leader of Germany. And Hitler himself attended the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, as most heads of state do. And as the nation's teams came by with their flag bearers out in front of them, at the time there was a tradition where as you passed the stand where the head of the home state was, many nations would lower their flags and they would give the Olympic salute to whoever the head of state of the host nation was. And the Olympic salute was to raise your arm out to the side, kind of like this. Looked very similar to the Nazi salute, except that it was out to the side instead of out to the front. So as these nations are coming by and they're lowering their flags when they pass by Adolf Hitler, and they're giving this salute, which looks very similar to his salute, and they're saluting Hitler in this way, especially when France did it, the crowd would just erupt because they knew what Hitler's ambitions were. They knew that he wanted to conquer the world and have everybody salute him. Kind of like Haman here. But when the United States team came by, they did not lower their flag. They did not dip their flag to Hitler. The United States flag is not dipped or lowered to anyone. And instead of giving the Olympic salute, they all continued to face forward, that is, to face their own flag, and put their hands on their hearts, the salute to the American flag. And it drove Hitler nuts that the Americans would not salute him, and instead they saluted their own flag. Very similar to Haman here. Extremely upset that Mordecai would not bow down to him. Instead, he only bows down to his own God. Let's continue now with verses 6 through 9 to see what Haman decides to do about this. It says, "And when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, it seemed repugnant to Haman to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout Ahasuerus' kingdom. In the first month, the month of Nisan, in King Ahasuerus' 12th year, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast before Haman for each day in each month, and it fell on the 12th month, the month Adar. Then Haman informed King Ahasuerus, 'There is one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction, and I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials deposit in the royal treasury. So it says, when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity. And this word identity, we hear this getting tossed around a lot today too. I want you to know real quick here, Mordecai is not identifying himself as Jewish. Mordecai is Jewish. He was Jewish by race, if you want to use that word. It's not just because he chose, to be Jewish. That's the way he was brought up. That's his heritage. He is a descendant of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So that's what makes him Jewish. Today, we hear about identities all the time and people, claiming to be a lot of things that they are not and just saying, well, that's what I identify as. Well, Mordecai's ethnic identity was Jewish because that's what he was, not because that's what he thought. And it's interesting here. It says when Haman finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, he decides, I'm not just going to kill Mordecai. I'm going to kill all of the Jews. Now, why would he do this? Well, there still is a fairly large Jewish population within the city and throughout the empire. Even though the Jews had been allowed to go home, many of them did decide to stay. And Mordecai knows that, or not Mordecai, Haman knows that if Mordecai won't bow down because he's Jewish, then none of the other Jewish people will bow down either. And he's saying, if Mordecai won't recognize me, then none of the Jewish people will recognize me, and I'll become a laughingstock to the Jewish people. So he decides, I'm not just going to kill Mordecai, I'm going to kill all of the Jews. And because, I don't know if this is because of their religion or whatever. By the way, the religion of the Persians at this time was Zoroastrianism, mostly. They worshiped the god Ahura Mazda, and there actually are quite a few Zoroastrians still around in the world today. But it says they would cast a lot, roll the dice, they would cast the pur, and that's going to come in, that name's going to come in, a little bit later. And because of that, that's how they were able to choose what month and what day they were going to do it on. They were going to do it in the month of Adar. This is in February or March, late February, early March. So Haman goes to King Ahasuerus and he says, there's one ethnic group. Now notice he doesn't say which. He doesn't say who they are. He just says there's a particular ethnic group out here that doesn't follow your religion. They're not Zoroastrians. And their laws are different from everybody else's laws. Now, we've talked about this quite a bit before. Why were the Jewish laws different from everybody else's? Because God wanted the Jewish people to be noticeably different than everybody else. God wanted you to be able to tell if a person was Jewish. And I've said that many times today. As Christians, we are to live our lives so that other people can tell that we are Christians just by watching us. We should be noticeably different than everybody else. But he says they don't obey the king's laws. They follow their own laws. Therefore, it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Another word that gets tossed around today. Toleration. We're supposed to tolerate everybody these days, except Christians, it seems. Christian people, except people who don't agree with our own views, and then, we are to be intolerant, I guess, or we're supposed to tolerate everyone except the intolerant, or I don't know how that works. But the people who tell us to tolerate everyone are actually intolerant themselves because they don't tolerate people who won't tolerate people. So he says, it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them, and he asks the king to sign an order authorizing the destruction of the Jewish people. And then he says, and I will pay for it. I myself will give 375 tons of silver to pay for this. This isn't going to cost the nation anything. This isn't going to come out of taxes. I'm going to do this myself. Now, what this tells me is this is personal to Haman. Haman is taking Mordecai's not bowing to him personally. He's not doing it because he honestly thinks that's what's best for the kingdom. He's doing it because he personally is taking offense to Mordecai. He is allowing his dislike of one person to shape his view about an entire group of people. And you know, the church gets treated that way a whole lot. There are those who don't want to become Christian or don't want to attend church because they know one person who attends church or one person who claims to be a Christian, and that person is not doing it the way he should. And for whatever reason, they don't particularly like that one person. So they take it out on the entire religion. They say, if that's the way a Christian is, then I don't want to be one. Again, we need to be living our lives so that people want to be like us, so that people want to join the church, so that people want to look at us and say, that's the way I want to be. That person has something that I want. Now, Mordecai wasn't doing anything wrong. It's not that, Haman was looking at him and say, well, if that's the way Jews are, well, in a way he was saying that. The way Jews are is they're not going to bow down to any particular person. They're only going to bow down to their God. But instead of praising him for his loyalty to his God, he takes a personal offense to it. So, a lot of things happen between here and our next reading. Mordecai uncovers a plot to assassinate Ahasuerus, the king. He informs the guards about it. They're able to prevent it. Mordecai's name gets written down in the book of records as someone who uncovered this plot. The king then one night can't sleep. And because he can't sleep, he asks one of his servants to get the book of records and read to him from it. Maybe because he thinks that's so boring it'll put him to sleep eventually. Or maybe just because he's trying to catch up on things that have been going on in his kingdom. And the servant reads about Mordecai being the one who uncovered this plot to assassinate the king. And the king says, oh, have we ever done anything to him? Have we done anything to reward him? And the servant looks in the records and says, no, we haven't. Well, about that time, Haman comes in. And the king asks Haman, Haman, what would you do if you were the king? How would you honor somebody if you felt that person was really worthy of honor? And Haman, in his selfish mind, thinks, the king must want to honor me. Haman thinks so highly of himself. He so much wants the recognition. He so much wants to be the star of the show. He says, the king must be wanting to recognize me. So he tells the king, I would put the king's ring on his finger and put the king's robe around him. And I would put him on one of the king's horses. And I would have one of the king's highest servants lead him through the city, shouting out, this is what's done for someone whom the king wants to honor. Let's look now and pick this up in verses 10 to 14 of Esther chapter 6. The king told Haman, hurry and do just as you proposed. Take a garment and a horse for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not leave out anything you've suggested. So Haman took the garment and the horse. He clothed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square, calling out before him, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried off for home, mournful and with his head covered. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened. His advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai is Jewish and you've begun to fall before him, you won't overcome him, because your downfall is certain. While they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and rushed Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. What happens when the sidekick wants to be the star? Sometimes he ends up getting put in his place. Do not think of yourself any higher than you ought. Do not try to place yourself above others in your own mind. If you do things worthy of recognition, you will be recognized. And even if you're not, God knows what you have done. If you are doing great things for God, you should be doing it only for God's recognition, not for man's recognition. And God will reward you for the things that you've done. Jesus said, whoever wants to be great needs to be the servant of all. Haman didn't do that. Haman said, I want to be great. I want to be the one that everybody looks up to. I want to be the one that everybody recognizes. And instead, he ended up being humbled. He ended up being the one having to lead his enemy, Mordecai, around. The great will be humbled, the Bible says. Pride goeth before a fall. And his wife even tells him this. Since Mordecai is Jewish, and you have begun to fall before him, you won't overcome him. You are not going to get yourself above Mordecai now in the eyes of the people. Haman should have just taken his licks and gone home. Instead, he decides he's going to hang Mordecai from a giant gallows. He's going to go through with his plan to kill the Jews. Esther intervenes. She gets the king to change the edict to allow the Jewish people to defend themselves. They do, and actually they end up killing many Persians. And that festival is still celebrated today as the Feast of Purim, named after the pur, the dice that they rolled to determine what day it would be on. In case you're interested, next year Purim is going to be on March 13th and 14th. Jewish people will go to their synagogues. They will read the book of Esther. It says, as the book is read, whenever they come to the name, when the reader comes to the name Haman and says it, all the people stomp the ground and say, "Cursed be Haman." This is just one of many attempts that Satan has had to try to eliminate the Jewish people, and failed. The Jewish people are a constant reminder of God's power, God's might, and even God's existence. They are God's chosen people. But as Christians, we get a lot of lesson out of this as well. Don't think of yourself higher than you should. If you do well, let others be the ones to recognize you. Don't toot your own horn. Don't go around saying, "Look how great I am." Haman didn't get that, and he ended up being humbled. In the end, he ended up being hanged on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And Mordecai ended up in the palace. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Again, please like, subscribe. If you can support me on Patreon, please do so. And I'll see you again next week.